Hello and welcome back to Immigration News and Views. My name is David Nachman. I'm one of the managing attorneys at the NPZ Law Group, Nachman, Fawani, Zimochek. We have offices here in Ridgewood, New Jersey. We also have offices in New York City and Midtown Manhattan. We also have an affiliated office in Mumbai, India, and we have also an affiliated office in Canada. With me today, I have Felicia Zeidman. Felicia is an attorney here in our office, and Felicia and I do a lot of work on I-9 audits and employment verification processes and helping employers to understand what they need to do with I-9s. We've actually done a previous video on I-9s, and if you're not familiar with the I-9 process, we would definitely recommend that you take a look at that video, because in that video, Felicia and I did a pretty good job of helping employers to understand what they need to know. But now we have a little bit of an update, because we just got back from a very long and significant meeting with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers here in our local district, and they told us a couple of things which are very interesting. So Felicia, with that, maybe you can tell our viewers a couple of things?
Sure. Well, let's start with the fact that ICE inspections have been up tremendously in the last year and are likely to go up even further. I think we talked about in our last News and Views segment that it was a likely corollary to any kind of immigration reform to have inspections of work sites come into force more frequently. We have pretty good substantiation of this fact at this time, so we're ready and waiting for more of these inspections.
Well, actually, Felicia, you made an excellent point in our last video, if I'm not mistaken, which I thought was terrific, and we should bring this back home for our viewers, and that is that with comprehensive immigration reform on the cusp, potentially, what we're talking about is the government is talking about potentially legalizing 11 million people. Now, if they are talking about legalization, the quid pro quo for legalization, of course, is an increase in enforcement. That enforcement will be, of course, at the borders, but it's also a form of internal enforcement, which means that they're going to go into the employers and they're going to hit them for fines and penalties and violations of these I-9 rules, which...
And I actually want to just say something that I have had in my mind for a long time and that I think everyone needs to know.
Let's get it out there. Yeah.
I'd like to say the public, but this is just YouTube, and we're just being pulled up because you had an interest in this topic. So you, the chosen public, should know that the fines for I-9s that are not in compliance are very substantial. So even for a company that is small, by any kind of national or international or even statewide standard, a company of 20 people could be looking, or 40 people, could be looking at liabilities of $30,000 for poorly prepared I-9s. We see it all the time, and it is in shock and horror that these employers deal with this issue now that it's on their doorstep with such an amazing amount of money. You know, you try to control the kinds of litigation that your company might be subject to, which would have these kinds of numbers attached to it. But nobody, I think, really comprehends the extent of the fines and penalties until they're looking at something where each of their poorly documented I-9s is being fined to the tune of $1,000.
Well, and I think, Felicia, you're absolutely right, and the point that you're making is a terrific one. I think that let's bring it really home for our viewers by helping them to understand the magnitude of the fines and penalties that we've seen in the cases that we handle here in our office. I mean, I would say, and you know, just check me on this, that we're handling cases that range anywhere in terms of fines that range from $20,000 for a smaller corporation on up to, you know, close to $750,000 for I-9 violations. So if you are viewers who are tuning in here think that, you know, this is something to just shrug off and ignore, you have another thing coming. You really have to tend to your I-9s.
It's not even something you can really explain away. You have to pay some attention to your I-9s now and set them right. There's just no getting around it.
So one of the really important things that we heard this morning, which resonated tremendously with me, is that they are going out now and they are serving new I-9s, they're serving new notice of inspections to many organizations. They have a certain number that they're going out, and they're actually probably, as we discuss this now, are en route to serving additional employers with these notices of inspection. So Felicia, what does that mean? It means that now there are going to be a lot more employers who are going to be looking for information about how to deal with an I-9 audit, and what are the types of things that they should know if they get served with this notice of inspection?
Sure, that's certainly important, what people should know if they are served, and I think the most important thing to know is actually to deal with it right away. So we do get a lot of people who, in the 11th hour, perhaps they've already been in the process with ICE for quite some time of back and forth, through different stages of inspection and notices of intent to fine and so on. They finally call us and they are ready to get some legal help. But a lot of problems can be headed off very early in the process. I'm going to call it early intervention.
Great.
You know,
that's exactly what it is.
I feel like I'm appropriating a name that's applied to so many things. But this is an intervention that you want to perpetrate upon your own company to make sure that you're dealing with ICE properly from the outset, and with your I-9s properly from the outset. And there's a lot of things you can do, starting with how you keep your documents that will influence the interactions with ICE and what rolls out from that. So starting with how you keep your documents, okay, we've been talking about the use of a segregated file. A segregated file is very useful, an I-9 file in the employee's employment file.
And I think we have to be careful about the use of the word segregate, because I think what we're talking about really is a separate I-9 file.
Okay.
That you keep a separate I-9 file, and that is, so your I-9s are not in your human resources files. And there's a couple of reasons why you want to do that. First and most importantly is, at the midnight hour, when you get served with that notice of inspection, you don't want to be rushing to your human resources file and pulling out all those I-9s, especially if you have thousands of employees. That's going to be a nightmare. So keep your I-9 separate. But what else about the I-9s? Attach the supporting documentation to those I-9s, especially if you're making copies of that supporting documentation. So if you take a look at a green card, make a Xerox copy of that green card and attach it to the I-9 form. Something that we were talking about in the car on the way back to the office here was, what about stapling?
We hate staples, and we...
Why do we not like staples?
You know, the way that you keep your documents is, assuming you keep them in a separate file like we're suggesting, is to keep them paper clipped. When you staple or fax or otherwise do something to a document that physically alters the way it looks on the piece of paper, it will be, it could raise questions.
Such as faxing.
Yes, such as faxing.
So
if you have a fax header, it raises the question, was this document recorded at the time that it was viewed, or was it faxed to me at a later date? And I hadn't seen the original, which is required, of course, for the I-9 form.
So these issues, it may seem like minutiae, whether or not a document is stapled or whether or not it's faxed, but you have to understand that when the notice of inspection is served, these documents, once you receive your chain of custody document from ICE, those documents go to an auditor who's keenly in tune to tremendous detail about these documents, including dates and, as Felicia's properly pointing out, physical modifications of the documents that could affect issues of timing or where the documents were kept and so on.
Right, so it's important to keep the photocopy of the document very clean. I just want to comment on something that you said about the fact that the auditors are so keenly attuned to these details. It's important to know that this is the government's business, and they're very, very serious about it. So the auditor will pick up on any small anomalies with your documents, including stapling and things like that. Including if it's been faxed 14 times, and so, or photocopied 14 times, they may have questions about that. Why should that happen, you know, in the scheme of business? And you have to be able to answer all those questions. So it's better just to keep your cleanest copy.
Exactly.
and your I-9 form in the separated file. Thank you for correcting me on that
No,
term.
no problem. Yeah, I think it's not wrong to say a segregated file, but I think that for the human resource managers or personnel who might be viewing this video, I think that explaining it as a separate file for I-9s and the documentation altogether may help them understand exactly what we're talking about a little more.
And David, should the I-9 files be kept in an I-9 filing cabinet, or should they be kept with the broader human resources file just as a separate file, maybe a different color from the larger human resources file?
And it's a great question, Felicia, and I know exactly what you're trying to ask me, and I always, whenever I'm asked these questions when we do speaking engagements for human resource managers across the country at their sites, they always ask me that, and my answer really is, it depends upon what your business practices are. Unfortunately, there's not a cookie-cutter answer to that. Each is done on a case-by-case basis, so the procedures that you choose to use has a lot to do with whether or not you have 1,000 employees or whether or not you have 20 employees. So it's really not something I can, identify as a cookie-cutter answer.
Okay, but I do want to comment upon the actual keeping of the I-9s.
Retention.
Retention.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you're not keeping them electronically, which is a whole other ball of wax, okay?
To be addressed in another video.
Yes, we could actually do a retention video. I would suggest that the I-9 files be kept in a safe manner because you don't want them to get destroyed. So whatever that means for you and your business's capabilities, whether it means a metallic filing cabinet in a room that's not likely to have a leak, or whether it means locked up in because they have to have physical safety. Maybe you're keeping your I-9s in a room that gets a lot of traffic, so they need to be locked up, but those I-9s have to be kept in a way that's safe, otherwise the burden will fall on you, the employer, to explain why you might have lost your I-9s in some way.
Exactly. So I think we're running out of time today, but what I'd like to do is just bring to your attention that we will be doing additional videos with regard to employment verification and employment sanctions. And we'll be discussing things like retention. We'll be discussing things like the electronic retention of I-9s. We'll also be discussing what the step-by-step things are that you need to be aware of when you go through an audit with the government. But the reason why we wanted to do this for you today is to bring home the real importance of the fact that the government is out there and they're going to be serving over the next week or so additional notices of inspection. Half of them will be what are called Re-Audits. So for those of you who have had audits already, the government is going back and looking to make sure that you're doing things properly. And the second half of their initiative is with regard to what's called critical infrastructure. And that means any organization that deals with the government's critical infrastructure. That could be access to a tarmac at an airport. It could be something that deals with software that's related to the government, a contractor of the government, a wastewater treatment plant, wastewater purification plants, and so on. The critical infrastructure is defined very broadly. So if you feel you're in a critical infrastructure organization, it's probably a pretty good idea for you to take a look at your I-9s, do that self-audit. If you have any questions at all, of course, Felicia and I, our firm, we handle this on a regular basis, and we're more than happy to make our services available to you. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and we look forward to being of assistance to all of you. Take care now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.